want to welcome everyone to our third Thursday Artist Talk. Today we have Nancy K. Turner, who is a teacher, an artist, a critic, a writer. She's been a writer for Art Week, Art Scene, Riot Material, Art and Cake, and she's an amazing, prolific artist who has the ability to transform materials into great, wonderful narratives. You'll find out what she's doing tonight. She's so amazing. She's a visual storyteller, and she also changes her narratives. Narratives from a variety of materials, transforming materials like bread-stained parchment papers into work that engages the viewer. Okay, so I will turn it over to you, Nancy, because you have a lot to share with us.
Okie dokie.
So welcome and thank you.
Thank you all for turning out. That's lovely. I started talking to Shelley and to Pamela before people got on, and I was thinking of a way to organize it. And the way I wanted to organize this talk is basically my journey. Well, as a matter of fact, you guys remember Cheech and Chong, Sister Mary Elephant, what I did on my summer vacation? So this is, if you don't, it's worth it, but worth listening to. But anyway, so this is what I did during the pandemic. And so the shelter at home, I have a studio downtown. And as a matter of fact, in December of 2019, Southern California Women's Caucus of Art came to my studio. I know Dallas was there, and I'm not sure who else was there. And then the pandemic hit, and I worked on my kitchen table for almost 2.5 years. So I wanted to talk about that. But what I had done during that time was to make a book. I just started the day that we had to be home, and I worked for 2 months. And anyway, a year ago, Jason, Jen, and Voice Love came to my studio, and they were going to photograph me, not me, myself. They were going to photograph the book, and only my hands were going to be present. So I went and I got a pedicure, and I wasn't supposed to be in the picture. Anyway, they came down, they didn't have the equipment, and they said, well, we'll do an interview. So they did an impromptu interview. And then I didn't see what it looked like. They worked, they were really busy. And just recently, they uploaded it. So that's what I'm going to show you. Then I'm going to go into the Quarantine Opus Book and going to work through my bodies of work. And you'll see how I went from very small to very big over the last 2.5 years. So I hope that works out. And I'm going to share my screen. Perfect. When I was 9 years old, I had a red skirt, and I got ink on it, India ink. And India ink does not come out of clothes. So my mother didn't make a big deal about it. She took something, I don't sew, but she took something, it's kind of called racking, I think, and she wrote my name over the black India ink. So she took something that was ruined and she made it into something quite beautiful. And I call that cultivating the emergent. And I feel that my work is about that, is looking for what is emerging out of the work and cultivating it. And so I don't come to the work with a preconceived idea. I don't know what it's going to look like. Even though I use collage elements, I don't consider myself a collage artist. I consider myself a mixed media artist, because I don't just use printed material and the work isn't normally flat. My work deals with the intersection of memory, identity, and I love the way time alters materials. I often embed narratives in my work. In the 90s, I worked with tar, lap cement, which coagulated. I like to incorporate chance. I always say that chance and randomness are my unpaid studio assistants. And I also often incorporate accidents into my work, because once you acknowledge an accident, then it's no longer an accident, it's intentional. part of actually my work has to do with the fact that I lived in an apartment. We didn't have an attic. We didn't have a basement. My mother threw everything out. And we had no documents of our history at all. And it was a different world. So I had one set of grandparents, but I realized they did speak English, but we never had a conversation with them. We never said, what was it like in Russia? You know, how was it growing up? How old were you when you came here? We never thought to ask them those questions. We never had those conversations. And I never thought about it until I went to Berkeley. And I remember I met somebody who, for some reason, had a family Bible, like an old family Bible. And he opened it up and he showed me it had all the births and deaths of his ancestors. And I thought that was fabulous. And I felt like, wow, I don't have that. We don't have that. And so in a way, I feel like I've been looking for my ancestors in thrift stores ever since, and finding other people. And I've been a repository for those kinds of materials. Once people realize that I like that I have a use for it, a lot of people have materials that they don't want to trash, but they're not museum quality and they can't leave it to anybody. So I become the inheritor of this material. And I came up with the concept of saving remnants, because in a sense, I'm saving remnants with these bits and pieces of letters and photographs and pins and all kinds of things that people say that are meaningful to them. And yet also Saving Remnants was a religious group that has a biblical implication as well. I have a penchant for paper and a penchant for fragments. And I thought about why do I like fragments so much? And then I thought, I grew up in New York, and one of the places we used to go was the Metropolitan. And we used to go to the Egyptian section, which was fabulous. It had like a temple. But I think the thing that I noticed most is they would have this little tiny fragment, and it would be on a pin. And then they would build the whole story. They would show you what that wall looked like, even though they had something that was maybe the size of a political button. And they would construct a whole story because of their research. I was at a party, and an actor asked me what I did, and I explained that my work had to do with memory, and that I used found materials, documents, and photographs that didn't belong to me, and that I worked them into my mixed media pieces. And his face lit up. Well, he said, would you be interested in tintypes? I was like, yes, I would. And he said, well, my neighbor passed away, and he gave me all these boxes, and I don't know what to do with them. He sent a friend over, and these boxes kept on arriving. And I opened it up, and I thought, wow, you know, there were all these letters. Somebody in their family was a marvelous archivist, because a lot of times I use these materials, and it's almost as if my unconscious or subconscious picks the materials. So I don't really, I know they're old, but I'm not really thinking about that particular date. And with the book that I just did, I started looking up the dates that were in the material I was using. And I found that it was amazing to see what happened on the day of the date, like what happened on August 3rd, 1891. And then you look it up and you'll see it's wars and blizzards. And it just seems like it's yesterday. It's the same kind of things that we're having now, except we're not having blizzards, we're having floods, and we're having wildfires. But, you know, it's the same catastrophes. There's 1893, there was a recession, a depression, which I didn't remember. And so it's connected me to my past. So I feel that my work collapses time and collapses history. That history is really cyclical. And, you know, everything that's happened, kind of, you feel like it's happened before and it'll happen again. And I feel like my studio is some kind of mysterious space, even though, you know, it sounds very California woo-woo. I feel like when I close the door, things arrange themselves differently, like Toy Story. You know, documents and letters that want to be in a piece pop up out of a pile. I once had an artist come to my studio who looked around. He was a painter, and he looked around and he went, oh, I see. The meaning in your work comes from the materials. And for me, that was a revelation. That was about 20 years ago, but I thought that's true. And so I don't really have problems starting because I can just go to any surface in my studio and there's a piece that needs to be worked on. I think I have a profound connection with materials, and for me, there are embedded narratives in those materials. And so a lot of times the actual pieces I'm creating are what I like to call archaeology of the soul. Okay, so I'm going to then go now and show, after I made the book, the Quarantine Opus book, which was seen in the video, and I put it on Instagram, people kept saying to me, well, how can we see it? You know, it was still deep pandemic. And I remember thinking, yeah, how can you see it? So I decided to take it apart, photograph it, and I made a facsimile, which actually I'm going to show you because I have a PDF of it. Not the whole thing, obviously, but I'm going to show you some of the synchronicities I was talking about. When Gavin Newsom said shelter in place, for some reason, like a child who heard something wrong, I heard shelter at home. So I brought all this stuff, I threw some stuff into some IKEA bags, took it home, was working on half of my dining room table. I had an empty book. This is an 8x10 book. And I just started, and I had a piece of tar left over from the floor of my studio with a nail in it. And I had a National Geographic from 1914, which was all about the Philippines, which I'll get into. And then I was just looking for pictures of homes and houses. And anyway, in the second edition, Shayna wrote something about it, and I'm obviously not going to read it to you, but her last sentence was, it's a bulging, crackling, aromatic, and ancient affair, talking about the original book. A magnificent old soul, by merging elements of her own history into its gathering of source material, she ensures that her story is just as present as her hand in this alchemical work of memory made flesh, which I thought was pretty cool. Okay, so you know how I said there were all these things in the book that I don't notice, that my subconscious notices? So just about a month ago, which is almost three years after I made this book, this is the first page to your left. And when I was making the book, I dated it. So this is page 1, and you can see it's March 18th, 2020. I didn't notice that this old piece, it was part of a wedding thing. It's 18th day of March, 1986, I believe. It was 124 years to the date, and I didn't notice it until recently. So some of the images I'm using had catastrophes attached to them. So these were images that were from a friend of mine who had given me stuff from his family who were Jews in Nazi Germany and escaped by going around the world. So there's that. And in the beginning, I was just, we thought it was going to last just a month. So here, this is look on the bright side, and it's about children. And here, children are, people are relating and playing. But within a day or two, you realize that the children had no play dates. They were isolated. And here are real World War II unused ration, stamps. And that was because I had never, ever seen empty shelves until like right before we had to just stay in our house. And we probably have forgotten about that. So I'm just sitting here, I'm working on it every day, 2 to 4 pages. And I have all this old material. So this is from an autograph book from the 1880s. May these pages be filled with many a token of goodwill. But then I noticed, and I was just doing these things, and later I'd go back and look at it. And over here, it was talking about the city was besieged, surrounded by the enemy. Slowly they consumed all the provisions that were stored, and famine was staring them in the face. This is when the shelves were empty. And so for me, it was amazing to go back and look at this. Some of this is from the actual documentation that my friend gave me of his family's identification from Nazi Germany. It was their original, and it had, the stamps on it. It was crazy. So then here, right before the pandemic hit, I was supposed to go on a cruise. So it was like, let me see if I can get, anyway, if you can see that, you could go a cruise around the world for $700. And also in the beginning, I was just thinking about shelter at home, which is not exactly what he said, but what I heard. And, people were losing their jobs, and they were worried about all kinds of things. And again, it's all about, I was just looking for things that had houses in them. And sometimes I was just making a house, but also the Little Prince, he was isolated. He was left on an island by himself. And again, the house shape. And 1914 was World War I. So the echoes of previous catastrophes kept on coming through my books and coming through my materials. And right around this time, so now this is the end of March, so people haven't been able to get, it's so, it's almost like you don't remember. So remember, nobody could get their hair done. Nobody could get their hair dyed. People started to have like gray stripes of hair. No one was doing their nails. And it was just like crazy. And then poor children were all by themselves, and it was that kind of a thing. So here are some of them, some of the pages. And this one, people started to go into debt. And this one, it says, a man deeply indulged in debt was walking the streets with a melancholy air. And this is almost like a bread line, but it wasn't really a bread line. And then here it's almost like Fiddler on the Roof. They're struggling to keep their balance. Again, haircut children. So these are all from my old, just papers that I had in this big IKEA bag. And around this time, it became the whole issue of educating your child at home. All the schools were closed, and it was just crazy. So they're just going to move along here to get to a couple of ones that I wanted to show you. Again, it was all about all these times people playing house. I wanted to show you this. So all of a sudden, this piece of paper that says Picciola appeared. It wasn't part of a book. I don't know where it came from. And it was like 19 years. It's an original piece of a book. And I had never heard of that. I had to look it up. And the story was amazing. It's about a soldier who was in solitary confinement, and his only a flower grew up through the concrete of his cell, and he gave the flower the name Picciola. And people were so isolated. They were in their houses. They were very isolated. There was just a couple of, again, I was just sort of looking for homes, from my material, doing the shape of houses. And by this time, okay, so this is now April. People are nuts. So here they are in their house. People are getting very paranoid. Nobody could fly. It was, so here in the book, it starts to get darker. And also I had one comic book, and it was Superman. And, Superman started in the 1930s and 40s. There were Jewish comics, and it had to do with looking for a hero in that troubled time. These papers back here are papers that I dyed myself in my driveway. And I like to say water is my co-conspirator. And so by this time you can see people are really, it's April, it's been a month of isolation. People are terrified, they're in their houses. But then this was the other thing. All of a sudden I look at this and it says December 20th, 1918. Well, that was the Spanish flu. People were dying. So all of a sudden, all of these materials in the book became more meaningful. I have death certificates from 1870. Again, it was like nobody was dressing. People were wearing sweats. And by this time, I used to work in a high school, but I was already retired. It became the issue of there were no graduations. And it became a huge issue. And I magically had in my IKEA bag a high school program from 1889. And all of these things that I began to find were, and here's another one from 1891. So there was kind of magical for me. And again, this is something from, we're trying to cure, remember, drink bleach. It was all that kind of craziness and, inflammatory diseases. And then people were trying to make money by selling hand sanitizer. Anyway, I don't want to make everybody crazy watching the whole book, but, you can actually, I'm going to stop the share now, but you can actually, it's on Blurb. You don't have to buy it, but you can actually preview it and look through it. But anyway, so that was the book. And then I was putting that on my Instagram, and my neighbor across the way, people were still not interacting, but my neighbor literally across the way said, I have something for you. And then she gave me a box full of postcards from her grandmother from 1905 to 1912. And sometimes when people give me something, I can't use it, maybe in 5 years I can use it. But for some reason, I was able to start my next body of work after I finished the book. And I did a series called the Seance Series. So I will show you that. So you don't have to read that. But, let me do full screen. So these were the postcards. These are all 12 inches by 12 inches. And a lot of time, especially when I'm working on paper, even though I'm very intuitive when I work, I often set restrictions. So for example, I decided that I had maybe 20 pieces of paper that were handmade, that were 12 by 12. I had all these postcards, and I decided I would do a body of work that I later gave the name the Seance Series, talking with the dead. Every day in the paper, you forget it was all about death. It was all about, it's so easy to forget all of that. But so these are all from that series. And if you got to see my show at Roswell, it was a 2-person show. I think it was March or beginning of April. No, it was April. At Roswell. It was 2-person, me and Tody O'Brien. She showed a grouping of these. So these are magazine transfers and layers of translucent paper that I have dyed. And there was a whole series of these. Often the titles come from some image that's actually in the work. And I don't know if some of you were doing it, but at the same time, Christine Shoemaker had a call and response. And I was doing some work associated with that as well. So some of these were earlier postcards given to me by somebody else. Recently, someone so these are from call and response. And in the long time ago, before there was eBay, which is kind of hard to remember, it's actually 33 years ago, my son was going to go to camp, and I needed a trunk. And I went into a thrift store and I got a trunk. And back in those days, nobody cleaned it out. So it was filled with this fabulous stuff. It must have been an elementary school or a first grade teacher's stuff. So she had all these things. It was either kindergarten or first grade. She had all these worksheets. She had puzzle pieces. And honestly, I didn't know what to do with it for about 20 years before I started using the puzzle pieces. So this is Solvay and coagulamine dissolve and combine, which is exactly what I do in my work, is I dissolve and I combine. And so it was a whole series, and again, there were 8 of them, but I only have 2 here. And this was also in call and response with some of my neighbors' pieces. And then this piece there was something called telephone, which some of us participated in. And these are also 12 by 12. And then I also do small works on panel. And so this one also has, you will soon have cause to forget your money troubles. I always love using fortunes because my work moves you from the past into the present into the future in a very cyclical way. And so I often do that. This is another piece where, and a lot of times I just deconstruct my own work. There was something there that I didn't like. It was ugly. It didn't work. I pulled it off, and then I liked the way it looked pulled off, and I started working on it. And in my school, when I was still working there, they threw out all this stuff, the library digitalized or whatever. So these are old microfilms. So I always have some random stuff that I end up using. So that's that. I guess people could unmute if you want to ask any questions. And then before I have a couple of more slideshows, does anyone want to ask me anything or do you want me to go through with the whole presentation?
Karina has a question. Let's use our reaction. Let's raise our hand down at the reaction. Okay, so
Yeah.
we can acknowledge it. Thank you, Karina. Thank you,
Okay.
Nancy.
Thank you, Nancy. That was, wow.
Oh, thanks.
Really had a lot of mind flash memories myself just looking. And I wonder, as I watched it, I was curious if you ever had dreams while you're working on these that would give you ideas, that something would come in a dream, something you're working on, and maybe you reflect on it and then you get ideas to go elsewhere with it. I just wonder if you work with your dreams at all.
Well, actually, it's very interesting that you asked me that, because everything that was typed were typed dreams from the 1970s. They're outtakes from my dreams. In the mid 1970s, one day I woke up in like 1975, I'm not kidding, and a sentence fragment, Southern California dream and diary pieces ossified at the high school level of existence, filled with sophomoric wit and ennui. That sentence fragment came out of a dream, and I did a whole body of work about that. But anyway, I want to show you 2 more things, and if that's okay with everybody.
Linda Levy has a question before you continue. You got to unmute, Linda.
Oh.
Was stunning. Thank you, Nancy.
Thanks.
What is your book format? What kind of a book do you use?
Oh, I'm one of these people who collects, journals and never uses them. I always think I'm going to do a sketchbook, and I do one sketch and I never use it. Anyway, it's a whole bubba mindset. So it was an empty hardcover, 10 inches by 8 inches. And the really weird and interesting thing is when I made a facsimile of it, it's almost identical. The color is a little cooler in the facsimile, but it's a 10 by 8 hardcover. It looks just like the real one. Of course, the real one is like a soft sculpture. You can't close it. It's like a fan. And of course, the book is a book. But I did want to show you. I have a couple of more things, and then I'd be happy to do some more. But let me see what else I have. Okay, so share. Let me go. So that was the pandemic. I think the next one is actually, okay, so I think, so, oh, let me go to full screen, sorry, thanks. Okay, so when Jason, Jen, and Voice Love came to my studio in August 2021, I didn't have this, but in my studio, I have all these bits and pieces of things, and they encourage me. I have altars, and I just make all this stuff kind of for myself. I never really thought of it as my work to show, but they loved it, and they put me in a show called The Practical Guide to Parlor Games and Magic. By the way, the big book was in a show called Scribes. So that was great. And then, so Voice Love and Jason said, why don't you just like make something? I was like, I've never been so anxious in my life. But anyway, this is what I made. And this is great. This on the floor. Seriously, in the 1990s, I did a series of paintings. I was doing Holocaust stuff. It was all with tar. It was very dark. Anyway, so I did these paintings. They were on stretch canvas, 24 by 48, and they never gelled. They were pretty much god awful. So I took them off the stretchers and I cut them out, and they sat there for years. And then maybe 10 years later, I decided to paint on them. It was still ugly. 5 years after that, I decided to collage on it. I still have no purpose for it. And it was perfect as floor cloths for this piece. Everybody loved them. Everybody asked me about them. It was hilarious. But anyway, so these are all, I never did anything like this before. The reason I got to do the shoe thing is I was really realizing in 2018, Christine Shoemaker, who then had a gallery called the Shoebox Gallery in the brewery, had invited people to make art out of a shoebox. And so I made two pieces that were sculptural for me. And I found these, they're called shoe lasts. But what's cool about them is they're stamped and they're dated. So much of what I have has a date on it because they're stamps or they're people's birth dates or passports, or people used to date their letters. So there's such historical references, and also on Pisces, and Pisces rules the feet. So anyway, so this was really something new for me. I had feathers, I had glass, it was really fun. And then I had some of my own earlier work. Some I worked on a little bit for the show, and I was able to make kind of this kind of wall piece with it. And then the box opened up. And this is the kind of stuff I love. This is from some Valentine, late 19th century, to will from somebody. It just breaks your heart, that stuff never changes. And, so what I didn't realize in this picture is these compartments open up, and this collage is on the inside of these doors. And there's cool stuff in there, but anyway, so those are the floor cloths. And anyway, so Jeannie said it was an altar with individual components. And there was a Ouija board I had in, which was from my father-in-law's home from like in the 1960s in Lyme, Connecticut. And seemingly indicative of a post-dystopian world in which our present is a memory. I kind of liked that. So then, okay, so I'm going to go. So all the time that I'm doing this work on my table, I'm doing the book, then I'm doing the facsimile, then I'm doing the Seance Series, then I'm doing call and response. I learned how to bake bread like everybody else in America. So I never baked bread before, and I thought it was fabulous. So I'm making all this bread, and these are the parchment paper. And at first I look at it and I think it's kind of gorgeous. Then I think it's kind of goofy because it reminds me of Jesus and the tortilla and Mary and the toast, So I start saving them. I have a box full of these things. And then I start collaging on them. Then I start stapling. And then this is from 19th century, from somebody's Christmas. And Voice Love and Jason say to me, we're going to put you in this show and do something. We'll give you a 30-foot wall. And I'm like, oh my God, what am I going to do? That's huge. So I ended up making, each of these is a strip of muslin. By the way, the show was called Memories of Tomorrow's Sunrise. And so each of these is a strip of muslin, and it became like a durational diary. There were like 26 strips. So basically I was trying to make something that I could put up myself and take down myself and carry, because it became very lightweight. So this was how, and the scale was enormous. So this is how I went from that little tiny book to a 30-foot wall. And that was my journey through the 2.5 years of the pandemic. And I moved back to my other studio in my house in March of 2022. And it had been my son's, I had turned over that studio to my son, who's a marvelous painter, and he had made a really beautiful studio. So I had empty walls, because if you've seen my downtown studio, there's no empty walls. So I could not have actually even made that piece if I didn't have my studio. So everything fell into place. So anyway, so I have now kind of segued into fabric, because I was working with muslin, and getting that 30-foot wall was like catnip. It was like, I became a megalomania. I went from this like little book on half of my dining room table. Then I took over my whole dining room table. Then everything was too big. I had to work outside in my driveway. And then eventually I got to that big 30-foot wall. So that was my journey. So I hope you enjoyed it.
Yes, I have a question,
Sure.
Nancy.
Sure.
So listening to you talk about your work, and as you're talking about it, you're telling us stories. And I know you say you work intuitively, but yet as you're putting the pieces together, are you making up the stories as you're working on it? Is that something that
I have
you
no
talk
idea.
to yourself, or you're just like, I can't imagine you just grabbing something and then it all cohesively works, because that seems, that's
No,
magic.
it's so interesting. I've had a lot more studio visits. I've gotten over my fear of studio visits. I think I told Shelley, maybe not, but every time I would have a studio visit, before the studio visit happened, I would trip and fall. I'd have a bloody knee. I'd have bloody hands. I was like a nervous wreck, but I'm like getting too old to be nervous about that stuff. So, but anyway, so I had a studio visit of this wonderful painter whose husband's also a painter. And it was very interesting. She said her husband said I was a formalist, and she said I was an intuitive. And I realized that they're both right, that I set conceptual limitations on myself when I work. Like, I'm going to work in the book, or there's even another book. It's I don't have it's on my website, and it's called The Dreamt Landscape. So Karina, my outtakes and my dreams are in that book. And I decided I had to paint it. And my son was painting his house, and I said, do you have any extra samples? Now, I'm a painter, that's my degree. I can mix paint. But there was something about, he said, yeah. So he gave me these colors that were already mixed up, and I made the pieces around those already mixed up, colors. And then I added some of my own things. But I like to set a constraint, either a grid. And I say part of my reliance and my love of the grid is because it's like scaffolding for a centrifugal force for all my energy and all my ideas. And you really can't go wrong with a grid. So a lot of times I have a hidden grid in my work, and that is a very formal element. But no, if I try to make the story, Shelley, it's corny. There's no way. I didn't even know that piece of paper said the 18th of March, 1896 until like about 3 weeks ago. And I have that book on my table. I made it and I made the facsimile and I never noticed that.
So
And
so when you go back looking at your work, are you then creating the story, or is it just something that
No,
because you're saying you're not making the story up as you're going along, but as you're looking at it, you see the story evolve.
well, it's not that I necessarily think of it as a story. It was just like, you know, it's kind of an evolution. Part of it is the way I am because I write about art. I'm used to, there's a certain left brain, very right brain, but also very left brain, where I have to analyze other people's work if I'm going to write about it or analyze. So I have a very analytical side. And in seeing that, I see these strands, I see the story emerging, but I don't put the story into place. The story happens and then I see it.
Maria, do you got to unmute?
Yeah, first I want to thank you. It's really a very enticing and interesting process that you go through. And it seems very free. It doesn't seem confined. It creates a sense that you can do whatever you wish.
Thanks.
Yeah, and that's an important part of making art that doesn't confine you rather than make you free. And that's an important part for all of us. I think that's, we take the freedom at a certain point, and we do that, but you are doing it as you work. It brought me to think about the Jurassic Museum, and I don't know if you're familiar with it.
Yes. The
Yes,
Museum of Jurassic Technology, right? That one?
right. And I think it's on Venice Boulevard.
Yes.
I think that the approach that he had to his display of the work, and I recommend that everybody goes and sees it because it is a mind-blowing event. Because bringing the impact of connectivity that happens as you walk along there, and somehow you're sitting in a room and some things come at you, and it changes the moment. It changes the connection. And I think that you're a natural with it. It doesn't seem to me that it's something you have to think about, you're doing it. And so I thought I would advise you to go to the Jurassic, but you're familiar.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
It's like a giant conceptual piece. I mean, when you go to the room with the samovar and you just expect Andy Warhol to come out like he's not really dead, you know? It's like, but that is very interesting what you said, because it is true. It's like, if I try to go on a path to the left, I'm going to end up on the right. I just have to know that I have to follow that. Like now I'm just, because I was working with muslin, and also people give me things and I go with it. So somebody just said, I have all this silk, do you want to buy it? And I was like, no, I don't sew, I don't want to buy it. And she like gave it to me. Well, it's this fabulous silk. And now I figured out I can glue it on canvas without it bleeding through. And now I'm off on a whole other tangent that if you talked to me 3 months ago, I wouldn't have been on. Oh, I also found a piece of a whole roll of some fabric and a free thing, and it was outside in the rain, and no one in their right mind would take it, but I took it. And so that led me to another thing. So part of it is, you're right, it's being open to circumstance, being open to chance. You know, to me, art is magic. And the other thing I was gonna say is like, so a lot of things happen, like I was saying in like the little video, when I got ink on my skirt and my mother fixed it and made it into my name. I'm somebody, as I bump into walls, I spill things, I drop things. So I have to be that person, because if I'm trying to be neat or clean or go in a certain way, it just doesn't work. It does not work for me. So, and I'm finally embracing that as a 75-year-old. It took me a while, but thank you, Deborah. That's Charlie. I don't know if Charlie's on here, but she looked at my studio. She said, "It looks like you're having fun," and I thought, well, that's great, because
Rena,
huh?
you're all, you need to unmute.
I just wanted to say, I'm sure you all know Faith Ringgold's work. We had the good fortune to go up to the DeYoung Museum. I knew her work before, but oh my God, if you get a chance, it is so incredible. Her activism, but also her work with textiles revolutionized it as being considered an art form. So anyway, all of you, if you get a chance, it's worth a trip up north, the DeYoung Museum. It's on for another month or two, I would imagine. You can look it up, but it's fabulous.
Mhm. Thank
Oh, I was
you.
going to say also, if we're going to just talk a minute about other things. So they're very interesting. I'm going to end up writing about it, but I don't know exactly when. The Hammer has a Joan Didion show.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, what, I was intrigued, I got a couple of books. I'd never read her books, but it's very interesting. And they have 3 fabulous shows. They have a guy I had not heard of, and it was so busy I didn't see his work. But my husband and my son said it was fabulous. Robert or Bob Thompson, he died at 29 and he did a whole body of work. So I have to go back and see that. And also some Picasso cut paper, which is kind of charming. But then there's one wall with this really interesting series where it was almost like he worked with Man Ray and it was a collaboration. So those 3 shows are really interesting. And if you're in Pasadena, there's a fun show with Picasso and Ang, where Picasso, you would never think of putting those 2 together, but there's an Ang painting where Picasso kind of took the pose. So that's interesting. And then downstairs, there's also a show of women artists who are in the Tamarind lithography, June Wayne. And it's fabulous. There's some people I'd never heard of, and of course Louise Nevelson and some other people. So if you're in Pasadena, that's interesting. And if you're on the West Side, go to the Hammer. Also, very good if you're into thrift stores like I am. The Trove, great thrift store, and terrific Persian food. It's I can never say this, Tehran Angeles, which is perfect, fabulous Persian food. Anyway, so that's that. But does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, Kathy has a question. Unmute, Kathy.
Oh, where is?
You have to unmute.
Yeah, there we go. Okay, I just wanted to say thank you for mentioning the Hammer, and I just wanted to remind everybody that on November 5th for the next Saturday salon, we're going to the Hammer.
Oh yeah, I saw that. Yeah,
So maybe we'll see some of the exhibits that you talked about.
yeah. I have to go back, but I'm gonna put in a shameless plug as I'm having and I actually might, if we don't, maybe 4 or 5 minutes, do a quick, I have one more thing to show you. I'm having a show at Shelley's. It's called The Archaeology of the Soul, which was what I was working at when the Southern California Women's Caucus of the Art came to my studio. So I can show you quickly, like,
Well, that's going to open up November 4th, the first Friday.
right,
If you're out here in the desert, come visit.
okay,
Stop by, see me,
okay.
see
So,
Nancy.
so this is, you don't have to read that, but my work's about reconciliation of opposites, lost and found, absence and presence, remembering and forgetting. I'm an artist in search of the archaeology of the soul. I do have to tell you that my work is about memory, but I didn't even realize, and my mother died over 20 years ago, and she had Alzheimer's for 20 years. And sometimes our autobiography is so close, we don't even realize it. I didn't even put together the fact that my mother lost her memory with my desire to recreate memories that never existed. And, oops, let me see if I can get, I don't want to do that. I want to. Now, I don't usually do this, but this is actually my real maternal grandmother, because most of the time I use other people's relatives. And these are pieces of paper that I dyed in my backyard. So I'm a big fan of water, because paper is made in water, and then if you wet it, it can become all these interesting shapes. And I was going to say, so the titles, all of these titles come from the I Ching, and it's because I use chance and randomness in my work so often. So I took a workshop, a one-day workshop, and it was paper making. And the woman is straight from Japan, Yukio Kunio, and all of this was the inside of milk containers is white paper. And this woman, I don't know if she has help doing this, but she took all these cartons and she had all this white paper. And I brought this cardboard with me, and I made a series called Reincarnation from it. So this is all, there's images in there, there's rust. This is some piece of rust that I found that I thought was gorgeous. But it was interesting to me too, because the titles were all about acceptance, like This is the Beauty of Acceptance, or about tragedy. And I don't know if you can see this, but this is somebody's, it's too hard to see, but this is somebody's will. And I used to use, and I still do use, tea bags in my work. And that's because I think it came from me being the age I am and watching the Vietnam War. And that was when they actually showed it. And you could see all the young men coming home in body bags. And I think that image of the bag stuck with me, and I began to use it in my work. And so again, you can clearly see my interest in the grid here. So this text, this image, a lot of these are from my own writings when I write about an artist. And these were the earliest ones. So I went on a trip. I was gone for 5 months. It's not supposed to rain in LA. I had left stuff out, and all this paper had gotten dyed by randomly. And then I looked at it and thought, well, that's gorgeous. So then I started dyeing things on purpose, putting them back into the water, putting pigment in, putting ink in. And that's how I developed this whole body of work. And so, yeah, so the titles, I kind of love the titles too. And Detachment is Freedom. So, oops, going back the wrong way. So now these three, talk about archaeology. These last three, I just redid, like within the last month. And Russian dressmaker arrives unexpectedly. That's this little piece. I had somebody's travel diary from the 1920s, and she wrote, "The Russian dressmaker arrives unexpectedly," and I just thought that was great. So when the work was first shown, it was shown in Yavapai, that's what it looked like. And now it's framed, and I'm sure it's going to look even better at Shelley's. So that's that. And it's an hour.
I have one other question.
Sure. Who is that?
This is me, Maria.
Oh,
You're
okay.
working with so many elements and so many ideas and so many spontaneous approaches to the work. At what point do you think you're done?
Well, I have to say that it's almost glacial, because I now take pictures of work in progress on my phone. I will see something sit for 6 months in one iteration, and then I'll come and I'll peel something off. So in one sense, I feel the work is fast, but then I'll look at it on my phone and say, I started this 6 months ago. So things will sit for a long time and brew and stew, and I move something an inch over, but then, what you're reminding me, I went to Skowhegan in 1966, and one of the people who came and talked to us, and this is, if you're young, was Isabel Bishop, who was a 1930s social realist. And somebody asked her, and we were all like, I was 19, how do you know when a work is finished? And she said, it has this. And there was basically no words. It was like, I took it to mean it had a presence. It had this. And so, the last 3 pieces, they weren't done. I didn't like them. I thought they were boring. I just worked over them, and then I just move them, and then bingo. It's like a puzzle. It clicks together. So that's the best answer I can give about it.
Excellent,
Thank you.
very good.
Well, thank you so much, Nancy. I wonder if anybody else has any last comments. I saw in the chat, it was funny, you were talking about the paper making from milk cartons, and Linda Levy said that the word reincarnation has the name carnation, like as carnation.
Oh, yeah, isn't that funny? I didn't even think about, that's what I'm saying. My mind does that stuff for me.
Mhm.
I don't, people have said interesting things to me. One woman who was recently bought my work said, I was talking to her and she said, oh, you're a medium. And I thought, oh, I like that. And I thought, okay. And then another artist looked at me and she said, you're a time traveler, which I thought, okay. But then it was interesting because somebody else at a show looked at my work, saw the stamps, and without having known that woman said, oh, stamps are time travelers. So there's this way that things fit together, kind of outside of me, and then they just sort of do, and they exist, so art is magic. I actually wrote that. I said, art is a vessel between art and magic. Art is a vessel between the spiritual and the material world, between the waking and the dream world. Karina, yeah. And so that's pretty much
Nancy,
how I do it.
when I visited your studio, I felt right at home because I like having
Stuff.
all of my stuff.
Stuff.
But your work is so serendipitous. Just as you were saying, you may not intend for, whatever the outcome is, but then when it is done and you go back, because we always go back and look at our work, and then you are even surprising yourself.
Always.
And I love that because I want people to see little surprises in the work that I do, and just little things, little discoveries and so forth. So I really appreciate that you get that as well in your own work. So very serendipitous. I loved your presentation.
Oh.
I love your work. I love your studio. I love you. I'm so glad that you did this presentation for us tonight.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I was anxious at first, and then I thought, well,
you're among friends.
how am I going to organize it? And but look at this. I took notes.
Oh gosh.
No, I took notes from the video, and I
Yeah,
thought, God,
yeah.
I basically covered everything because I don't want to say it again,
Right.
Because it's hard to listen to your own voice. You're
You
like,
did a good job though. You expanded beyond the video, and the video was well done. I appreciated that.
Wonderful presentation. Nancy,
Thank
thank
you.
you so much for having us.
Thank
with
you. Thank
and
you.
sharing your
Thank you for
artwork.
listening and being interested. That was great.
Excellent. And you
If
can look
anybody comes out to the desert, you can see some of this stuff in person.
either.
It's kind of interesting in person. The surfaces are really kind of intriguing.
Yeah.
I have to
It's
say.
nothing like seeing texture in person.
Exactly. And your website is, it's in the chat.
Yeah, it was in the chat. It was just Nancy Turner Studio.
Nancy Turner Studio.
Yeah.
And also, if you're a sadist, you can watch the video again.